Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night from 2014. Classifying this film is a task all unto itself. The film is made by an Iranian American, made in LA, but it is in Farsi or Persian, the language that's spoken in Iran, and it is the whole thing is set in some nebulous part of Iran in even in a time period that's hard to place. It is a fascinating film in a ton of different ways. And right off the bat, I'm glad that I watched it. It is low budget. It is made by an independent filmmaker. It is written and directed by the same person. I'm probably going to butcher her name. Anna Lily Amirpour. Like I said, it was made in LA, but that really sets us off in this fascinating direction in terms of talking about similarities and juxtapositions. Because this whole film, in a lot of ways, is an effort in juxtaposition. How do I talk about this film without talking about this film? Boy. What's fascinating about this film is that it's hard, among many other things, it is hard to classify into a particular genre. I watched it with the intention of watching a horror film. Coming out of it, I'm not necessarily sure that it is. It has horror elements, but it is more along the lines of a drama, I would say. But it is clearly made by somebody who has a deep appreciation for and an eye for a number of different genres and cinema from different countries, and a whole lot of, unique and interesting stylistic choices. As far as the story goes, there isn't a lot. It's pretty thin on the ground. I wouldn't move this into the area of being a character study. It's a very, it's a voyeuristic film. I've used the term before, but it comes, it's less in its cinematic styling, but more in the sense of being a snapshot of a small group of people during a particular period of time. The whole thing is in black and white. I guess I haven't mentioned that yet. And man, this is some of the best work I've seen done with black and white film in a very long time. Pretty much every shot in the entire film makes really, really good use of the fact that this is black and white. This is not some sloppy, hey, what if we made it moody by making it black and white? This is somebody who clearly knew what they were doing with black and white film and knew how to use light and shadow and costuming and makeup and all these other things to really emphasize black and white and shades of gray. And again, to come back to what I was saying at the beginning, it's really so much an effort of, cinematic choices to emphasize juxtaposition, whether directly relating to what's being the story that's being told on screen, or indirectly to add contrast or to contrast with what's happening in the story, what's going on screen. The cinematography works in conjunction with the relatively light storytelling methods to give so much extra flavor to scenes that I could not possibly see. Like, this was clearly conceived, to my mind, this seems to be clearly conceived from the very beginning to be shot in black and white. Like from the point of script writing. And I think it works really, really excellently. Even if the core concept isn't that appealing to you, I think anyone who appreciates good, cinematic work, and especially anything that can sort of stray away from typical Hollywood cinematic direction choices, I really appreciate that from this film. In a lot of ways, it reminds me of some aspects of the French New Wave movement, not just because it's black and white, but also in some of the cinematography choices. It really hops around quite a lot in terms, not just in cinematic choices, but also in the storytelling choices and the pacing as well. It has a very, it seems wishy-washy, but the word I want to use is ethereal feel to the scene, between shot to shot and scene to scene, in a way that can be at times confusing, but feels perpetually deliberate in terms of telling an artistic story. If nothing else, I would be pretty surprised if there was much involvement by anyone who was involved in distribution or anything like that, in terms of affecting the actual artistic output. I believe this was mostly crowdfunded, or wholly crowdfunded. Vice Films has their name on it, but I assume they probably just did distribution on it. But the film uses its scope and budget extremely carefully, and keeps the number of characters low. It keeps the number of locations low. It keeps the filmmaking itself relatively simple. But that does not mean that they skimp anywhere. In fact, to go along with the really deliberate cinematic choices and the use of black and white film, there are a lot of really striking visuals where it's very clear that every visual element in a shot was placed very carefully to keep the shot as uncluttered and sort of minimalist as possible, while still being visually striking and working towards, adding to the storytelling that's going on with the cinematography. As far as the actual characters themselves, it's in Farsi. I don't speak Farsi, but my impression is that all of the characters did a great job. I thought everybody was, very believable in the roles they were intended to play. All of the emotions felt extremely real, sometimes to the point of being somewhat alarming. It's not that any of the characters are particularly deep, or that you get to know any of them particularly well. And that's what kind of keeps it away from being a character study in a lot of ways. But the very sparse dialogue and the the acting done through body language is very substantial and tells so much of the story just in small movements and subtle direction. And it really leads to an overall very quiet but somewhat haunting dramatic story. like I said, it's not particularly horror, but it is. It's got elements of that still you might not feel afraid or unnerved in the same way I think that you might feel from a lot of other horror films, but even the more subtle ones. But there's some, creepy imagery, unsettling interpersonal interactions and things like that. So much of it is about like a very human element to the horror. That that's really a standout. What is kind of coming to mind that I'm not as much of a fan of is sort of the overall arc of the story. If only not because anything feels particularly wrong with it, but because this is, I don't think this is a spoiler. This is ostensibly a vampire film, but as far as how vampirism is used as a literary device, it differs dramatically from a lot of other vampire portrayals. And yet at the same time, there's a lot of sort of, again, that juxtaposition between shirking a lot of typical vampire lore, or even the idea of vampiric motivations, or in a more literary sense, the use of vampirism as a metaphor for in the historical context of whether it's monarchy or capitalism or whatever. It shirks a lot of those things, but still reaches back into sort of using it as a tool to critique power dynamics, and in particular aspects of Iranian American or Middle Eastern American experiences. And I think that's always really interesting to me with any foreign, well, I don't even want to say foreign film. Because language is not particularly the aspect that I find most fascinating, but stories told by people who have, who are either, immigrants themselves or first generation from immigrant families, or who have experienced, their life experiences have been a juxtaposition of two cultures that are sometimes, looked at as very clashing. I think it's fascinating to see how this film interprets post-revolutionary Iran, and the parallels that it draws between social dynamics under that context that are still relevant as social dynamics in European or North American cultures. Likewise, as I pointed out towards the beginning about this being shot in LA, it is supposed to be set in Iran, and it's not something you may necessarily give a lot of thought to until you see it on screen. But the use of LA imagery to remind you of the geographical similarities of these two places, halfway around the world from each other, that, deserts and oil derricks and poverty and all these other things that are, if not universal experiences, at least similar and sort of socially reflective in terms of their what they mean in a cinematic sense. I'm feeling like I'm rambling a lot talking about this film, and I'm trying to be cogent, but short of summarizing the film in full, it's incredibly hard to talk about this film. I think one more thing I do really want to talk about is the music. With the soundtrack is really, really good. Music and sound design in general is used fairly sparsely in the film, but when it is, it's extremely deliberate and it works really, really well as an augment to the film. Some of it is used diegetically, some of it is non-diegetic, and some of it sort of skirts the line between the two in a way that's really interesting. Almost all of the music is either instrumental or it's in Farsi, or there's one song, I believe. I think there's only one song in the entire film with English lyrics, but they all work really, really well as an augment to the film. And stylistically, the music that's chosen, I'm actually not sure whether how much, if any of it, was composed specifically for the film. But it does reflect certain sort of cinematic history. I'm sorry if you can hear noise in the background from outside. There are elements in the compositions that are reflective of a variety of different musical backgrounds. But most interestingly to me is the use of certain musical elements that are seem to come directly from westerns. It's interesting because this is some of the marketing material for this movie refer to it as a vampire western, which I'm trying not to read too much into, and I don't think anyone else should either. But it is interesting as a musical element in what it says about the scenes that those choices are used in. So I really appreciated the soundtrack overall, and I think it worked to add a lot to the scenes where they used it, because a lot of it is, kept pretty quiet. Anyway, yeah, this is just getting ramblier and ramblier. So let me more or less cut it here. I think this is a really fascinating film. It's not super long. I think anyone with if you've liked some of my other slightly more odd recommendations about artsy or cinematic appreciation films, I think this is an excellent watch. So aside from some somewhat concerning imagery, which you can opt out of, I think it's a great thing. Anyway, thank you guys for watching a very rambly episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been the Social Solipsist, and I will see you guys next time.